Now, one of these panel antennas is not the same as the other. These were sent in by a subscriber, where it's one of the first antennas that he picked up for him and his son who got into quadcopters. And this came from a model shop in the UK. He can't remember how much he paid for it, but he was using this for about 3 months, and then, you know, they both really got into the hobby. And while they were using these over the 3 months, it seemed that one of the quadcopters got a lot further out than the other one, and they put it down to one of these panel antennas not performing as well as the other. Now, as far as looks are concerned, they both look absolutely identical. It's the same casing for both panel antennas. They both say on the back that they're for 5.8 gigahertz. They also say that they are 11 dBi, so they've got 11 dBi of gain, but as I said, one of them is not the same as the others. Now, before I crack these open to have a closer look, let me take them over to the test bench and see if we can figure out which one is the poor performer before we open these up. It should be interesting. So here's the first antenna on the test setup then, and if we take a look at the spectrum analyzer itself, you can see we're not getting much of a frequency response. I've got the spectrum analyzer set at 5.845 gigahertz there, and it's centered on that, and you can see we're getting a few dips around here, but nothing particularly major. It's got quite a wide band here where this could potentially be a good sweet spot, and so could this, but as far as 5.845 gigahertz goes, pretty poor really. So let's put the second one on and see what kind of response we get from that one. So this is the second one. This is antenna number 2, and you can see a much better frequency response at 5.8 gigahertz there. We've got a lovely dip bang in the middle of 5.845 gigahertz, and then if we wanted to operate outside that frequency to the right or to the left, you still get a good frequency response there. Because I've got my hand in the way, it is moving up and down a little bit, but you can see it's much better than the first antenna. So this is the setup that I've got for the second test, and it's something I've been playing around with for quite a while now, and I really want to take this idea and produce a much better test setup that can actually show how well an antenna performs when it comes to power, how much power it does receive and how much power it transmits, and we can equate that to gain as well. But this is the simple setup that I've got here, so let me talk you through it. First of all, we've got a waveguide there that's tuned to 5.8 gigahertz, and I've got a little 5.8 gigahertz transmitter feeding into that waveguide. Now, on the top of the waveguide, I've got a measuring rod there, so each antenna is exactly the same distance away from the waveguide here that's transmitting the signal. And I've got the test antenna here hooked up to the power sensor on my power meter, and what it does is equates to how much power I'm picking up onto the sensor, and then being displayed on the power meter, and then we can test it against a second antenna, and if the second antenna has a greater amount of power being picked up by the power sensor, then we can say with quite certainty that the second antenna is going to be more powerful when it comes to a receiving signal. So I really want to take this forward in the future, build up a proper setup, probably get a pretty decent reference antenna that we can use as a reference on something like this, so we can measure the reference antenna first, and then we can compare any antennas that we test then to the reference antenna, and that will give us a good indication of how well a particular antenna performs against a reference antenna. But for this setup, all we're going to do is test the two panel antennas here just to see how well each performs. So if we find out that one picks up more power than the first one, for instance, then we know the second one is more tuned to 5.8 gigahertz and it's performing much better than the first one. So I've calibrated the power sensor on the Boonton power meter. I've had it on for about half an hour to warm up,
I've got the little transmitter set up and running now, so we're transmitting a signal to that antenna, and you can see there on the power meter it's about 3.85. It fluctuates a little bit, which you can probably understand. It's not under best conditions, it's just to give us a general idea, but we're getting about 3.80 there. So remember, this one is antenna number 1, and this is the one that performed worse on the spectrum analyzer. It had the worst frequency response. So let me hook up the second antenna, and hopefully, if I've got everything set up correctly, you should see a difference, because I'm kind of thinking with the frequency response of the second one, it's going to perform a little bit better. So I've got the second panel antenna set up. I'm now feeding a 5.8 gigahertz signal into there, and you can see straight away on the Booton power meter it's picking up a lot more of that RF, almost 10 milliwatts. It's dropping down slightly, and that's due to the little transmitter heating up, but you can see it's seriously outperforming the first one, if not twice as powerful as the first one. So this little test, I think I can definitely do something with this in the future, and come up with an idea of producing a much better test setup using this to give a general idea of how well an antenna will perform. So I'm trying to debate which one to open first. Number 2 did perform the best on the spectrum analyzer, had the best frequency response. It also picked up just over double the amount of power than number 1 did. So I think what we'll do is open number 2 first, have a look at that, and we can comment on its construction and everything else, and then we'll have a look at number 1, and that'll give us a good comparison to hopefully we'll see straight off the bat why this isn't performing as well as this one. So I've got the spudger then to crack this open, because I think they're held in place with a little bit of glue in all 4 corners. They've probably got some little posts that go into each other in each of the corners, and there's probably a little bit of glue on there as well, just to make sure it doesn't pop off by accident. But on the back here, and it's the same on the first one as well, apparently they're 11 dBi in gain. So let's take a look at that first then. So see if I can pop this open. And there we go, this is the better performing one. Now, one thing I can tell you straight off the bat is that this isn't 11 dBi. It's probably around 7 dBi. We're getting about 3.5 dB for each one of these elements. So it's just physically impossible for this to do anything more than around 7 dBi, and you know, it's just mathematically impossible as well. So they're exaggerating with the dBi straight off the bat, but I have seen these cases on other antennas before, so this case is probably a generic case that these manufacturers buy, and then they put their own antenna inside. So I wouldn't go too much off that on the back of this, and they've probably just added that in the description because, you know, it says 11 dBi on the back, but these cases are pretty generic. I have seen them before. So as I said, this is probably around 7 dBi. So we've got a nice reflector on the back there. It's not aluminium because the coax is soldered directly onto that reflector there, and we've got the 2 driven elements here separated from the back reflector here by some foam, and it's that foam that's holding the main driven elements in place. It's doing a pretty good job of holding it in there as well. And you can see here that we've got the driven element part of the coax, the inner braid here, inner core of the coax, sorry, soldered directly into the middle here, and then it's just taken out onto the 2 main driven elements here. So pretty nice construction really inside. I mean, I don't think these cost a lot of money. I've seen, as I say, you can't be sure because of the cases, but I have seen these on eBay for as little as about £3, free shipping from China. So this is the better one then, so let's have a look at the bad one next. So now for antenna number 1 that performed worse than the second one. Let's crack this open again. It looks like it's glued in. So straight off the bat, I think we can definitely see why this is poorer. Instead of some tin on the back there as a reflector, we've got some
silver aluminium tape. It definitely looks like aluminium because they haven't soldered onto it there. We've got foam again holding the two driven elements in place, exactly the same size as the two driven elements on here, so definitely not 11 dBi. But I'm just looking at this, and I think one of the reasons why it would be extremely poor is because it's grounded out onto that back reflector there. Let me get the multimeter and just give that a test. So let's check continuity then to make sure it's not grounded out, and no, it's not grounded out onto the back reflector there. If I put a little bit of pressure here, you can hear there that it's shorting out. But let me check the ground plane here, because they're using a metal tag to make contact with this tape here to ground onto the ground plane, and no, that's not connected to this aluminium tape whatsoever. So this effectively has no ground plane, so that might be, you know, one of the big reasons why it wasn't very good at center frequency at 5.8 gigahertz, and it was extremely poor at picking up any of the power from the second test. I mean, also because this is using aluminium tape and this is using a piece of tin, we're going to get a much better back to front to back ratio with this antenna than this antenna. And contrary to popular belief, RF at these kind of frequencies will travel through metal. Metal doesn't reflect all of that signal all the way back, so the front to back ratio means that we've got more energy coming in this direction, which you would hope to have with a directional antenna. But with this antenna, if it was grounded onto this tape here, it's not going to be as good. It's going to let a lot of that energy travel out in the opposite direction, so it's not going to be as good directionally as this one with the proper tin in place here. But because it's not grounded out at all, means this has got no ground plane, so that's why it was poor performance compared to this one. Now, it would be very easy to take this one and, you know, put a decent piece of metal at the back of it like this one, and directly solder the coax onto that, just like they have on this second antenna here. So we could spend a little bit of time and make this perform much better. And again, hopefully I've shown it's not 11 dBi. There's so much exaggeration with dBi with a lot of these antennas from China. It just seems to be a one-up on you know, the next seller behind, so it kind of stacks up on top of each other. People have to kind of bull to get one over on somebody else, and then they bull to get one over on them, and it just seems to spiral out of control really. But I hope you found this video interesting, that you know, going by what something looks on the outside, even if you buy them from the same seller like this guy did, you're not always getting the same thing on the inside, and clearly this is going to be much better than this, but overall neither of them are anywhere near 11 dBi. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up, and hopefully you'll join me on the next one.